Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 178, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing new claims that Syrian President Assad carried out a chemical weapons attack. These claims lack evidence, however, President Trump has already taken to Twitter to condemn Assad over the allegations. The Syrian government denies that they were behind the attack. However, a similar situation played out last year, and even though evidence was lacking, the United States government went ahead with an attack on the Syrian government. So what we're talking about here is very important, and it's very important that the United States government knows if Assad is behind this attack and what the repercussions would be for attacking Assad before going ahead and carrying out an attack. However, with John Bolton entering the White House and Donald Trump already making statements on Twitter, we could be in trouble. If you want to share my discussion on this topic, check out foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. On Friday's episode of the show, myself and Will Porter covered the situation in Syria, so I'm not going to recap the whole thing. I just want to recap what's relevant to these current claims of Syrian chemical weapons. If we start at the beginning of 2018, 7 different rebel groups held the Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, neighborhood of eastern Ghouta. While all the rebel groups had jihadist leanings, they had different backers and different ideas for what they want to happen in Syria. And one particular group was backed by Saudi Arabia and controlled the Douma. I hope I'm saying that right. It's spelled both D-O-U-M-A, and I see it spelled just D-U-M-A as well. I guess about 2 months ago now, Assad started a brutal campaign to get the rebel groups within eastern Ghouta, I guess, to either surrender or die. And at one point ended up killing over 1,000 civilians in the span of just a couple weeks in that air campaign. However, recently, those rebel groups have started to surrender, and most of the Al-Qaeda-linked groups are able to surrender and go to the Idlib province of Syria. Like I said, that group backed by Saudi Arabia, I believe it's Jarrah Islam, remains in the Douma neighborhood. About a week ago, I believe, an agreement was reached, brokered by Russia between Assad and this group for these Syrian rebels to start moving to a different town in Syria. They really weren't welcome in the Idlib province because they fought against the other rebel groups while they held the eastern Ghouta neighborhood. It looked like some of these rebels and their families were leaving the area. I believe Assad was only allowing them to take small weapons, and one of the sticking points was what people are reporting to be $900 million, which seems like an incredible sum of money to me, in cash of some kind with them to their new place. However, Assad insisted that they leave that money, and so this has been somewhat of a contentious issue. As you can imagine, like I said, this is a very large sum of money that this rebel group has apparently been sitting on. And it may be that that number is a little bit inflated. But on April 7th, there's now allegations that a chemical weapons attack occurred near a hospital. I've seen reports in the teens and the high teens number of people that died. I saw one report say 25. I saw one say 35, and I've seen one say 40 and one say 45. So I'm just going to go with 40-ish because that seems to be the most reported number by sources I trust. The chemical weapons attack occurs, and immediately the rebel groups blame Assad. The international community is relying on reports from the White Helmet, which are a group of workers that move around and operate within rebel-held areas of Syria. I believe they get some funding for the UK, but are often backed by rebel groups, and including the Al-Qaeda-linked rebel groups as well, and are known to form propaganda against the Syrian government. These are not people without bias, and so while I'm not trying to say that every single member of the White Helmets is Al-Qaeda, some of them are, but all of them seem to have a bent against Bashar al-Assad and willing to carry out propaganda to help the Syrian rebels win the war. And something that I've talked about in past shows, it seems like this is the only source that American media has really cultivated in Syria. Whenever they're citing number of people dead in rebel-held areas or any kind of reported crimes that Assad carries out, they always cite the White Helmets. And I know that Doctors Without Borders has operated within Ghouta as well, and so it's not like there may be some other sources that they could use, but they always seem to go to this one, even though the Al-Qaeda ties are known. Another interesting note about this attack, and this is really the only other evidence we have, is that the symptoms that the victims seem to show, at least from the video that you could see, suggest that the attack was a sarin attack. However, witnesses at the scene are reporting smelling chlorine. And so this, can mean a couple of things that I'll get into as we go on, but it does suggest some inconsistencies in the story put out by the White Helmets. The most disturbing thing about this attack is its similarity to the attack that happened last year in Sheikoun. As I've already explained about the current Syrian battlefield, these Syrian rebels are about to lose, and that was very much the case last year, right before the Syrian chemical weapons attacks occurred in Sheikoun. This is important because if Assad is about to win the battle, then you have to answer why would he use chemical weapons. The one big red line that the United States has drawn in Syria was that Assad is not allowed to use chemical weapons, and we could see this by the tweet today. At the most, 45-ish people died in this chemical weapons attack. However, in a 2-week span, the Assad government killed over 1,000 civilians, suggesting that bombing campaign was a lot worse in the toll of civilian deaths as compared to this chemical weapons attack. However, this chemical weapons attack is drawing a lot more international criticism. Likewise, the chemical weapons attack in Sheikoun last year didn't kill that many people as compared to the number of people that died daily by the Syrian civil war. And I'm not trying to trivialize anybody's deaths. I'm just trying to explain to you that there are, while these chemical weapons attacks are bad, people are dying from conventional weapons in far larger numbers. Likewise, if you move down to Yemen, the situation there's tens of people dying in Saudi airstrikes every single day. Every single day. I just want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to exaggerate. Saudi airstrikes are killing civilians every single day. People are starving to death, dying from disease, preventable stuff. And we're not saying anything about that. And so for whatever reason you want to say, the United States in Syria, if they're going to escalate and use more force, is going to be over chemical weapons. And so it would seem very odd that if Bashar al-Assad was trying to win the Syrian civil war and was on the cusp of a victory, and then suddenly he used chemical weapons, which he knows is the one thing that's going to provoke the United States, and it makes it very difficult for Russia to defend at the UN. It doesn't make sense. What would his motive be there? Because this seems like it would go against his path to victory, which he was already pursuing just fine through his conventional weapons means. Now, some people like to, kind of throw out there, well, Bashar al-Assad's an evil dictator, so why do evil people do evil things? And I do kind of understand that argument because as we've seen through the Syrian civil war, Assad has done some absolutely brutal and reprehensible things. The man is absolutely a war criminal. However, we've also seen that Bashar al-Assad has been very careful and very navigating throughout the Syrian civil war and has somehow managed to retain power in the face of a United States attempted coup in that country. We backed the Sunni rebellion to Assad, even if that meant arming ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And Assad has been able to very carefully navigate the international community, the politics within Syria, the regional politics, and I guess in the best way possible, manage the world superpowers. The United States, Russia, and China are all involved in Syria. And so it seems to me to be very unlikely that Assad would suddenly break character and do something that he knows is going to upset one of the world's superpowers and potentially get some bombs dropped on his palace in Syria. However, from the perspective of the Syrian rebels, if you're already surrendering and you're about to lose and you have absolutely nothing to lose, then why not do the one thing that in the past has proven to get the Western countries involved and may save your asses? Because that seems to, they're kind of throwing up a Hail Mary, praying that the Americans will come get involved and start bombing Assad. And so while everybody kind of looks and says, oh, well, Assad has the motive because these are his enemies. Yeah, they're his enemies, but he has other methods of killing them. You really have to kind of explain to me, and nobody's ever done with any of the chemical weapons, been able to explain to me why Assad would suddenly break character and his very careful military strategy and do something reckless and stupid in these cases. Now, Sheikoun, I think, turned out to be a little bit of a different story and not maybe an all-in-all-out false flag. This was a situation that was likely exploited by the White Helmets and the Syrian rebel groups, but was not caused by them. On April 4th, the Russian government notified the Americans that they were going to carry out a strike in Sheikoun against what they believed to be a meeting of jihadist rebel groups. That strike hit the target, that happened to be located in a warehouse. In the basement of that warehouse, there were lots of weapons and chemicals and fertilizer and all kinds of other stuff. And so you could imagine that all this stuff burning together is going to create some pretty nasty fumes. And this would more accurately explain what happened in Khan Sheikoun, because some of the alleged victims of the attacks turned up at the hospital before the time the attack was claimed to have occurred. Some of the civilians presented with symptoms that weren't consistent with either a chlorine or sarin attack, just, being exposed to chemicals in general. Also, again, the smell of chlorine in the air, despite some of the people presenting with symptoms that would more indicate sarin. And I'm going to link to in the show notes page what I think is probably the most definitive article on the Khan Sheikoun attacks, authored by Seymore Herson. And so for those of you who want to really get into it, check out that article. The very odd thing in both of these cases, too, is that if Assad is trying to use chemical weapons, the fear about chemical weapons is they're supposed to be a weapon of mass destruction, meaning that they could kill a lot of people very easily and very quickly. And we saw this during the first chemical weapons attack, I think in 2013 in Eastern Ghouta. If at that time you can remember back to that attack, Obama had drawn a red line saying that if Assad used chemical weapons in Syria, then the United States would get involved. It turns out that after that, Syrian rebels about to, lose some territory, carried out a chemical weapons attack, and suddenly Obama was saying that his red line was crossing, that he was going to get involved in the Syrian civil war. But over 1,000 people died in that attack, and so you can see there that, why chemical weapons are deadly and feared. However, in this attack, and in the Khan Sheikoun attack, only tens of people died. And again, not to, say that those people's lives don't matter or anything, but if Assad were to use a weapon of mass destruction, why is he using it in such a low quantity that only a couple people are dying? It would seem to me that if he, wanted to use chemical weapons for a reason, he would use them in a way that would kill a lot of people and clear out the area. That way it would solve all of his problems. And so that's really all we know about the current chemical weapons attack, is that it occurred. It was near a hospital. Symptoms like sarin. People said they smelled chlorine. And then we get Trump sending out some tweets. In one tweet, he said that Assad was an animal and that it was the failure of Barack Obama to not go after Assad in 2013 that created the problems that we have today. Now, apparently Donald Trump has been talking to John Bolton an awful lot, because this is flat out untrue, and that he knew it in 2013. And I'm sure everybody could go online and find these, but I'll link to one on the show notes page. And it's a collection of Donald Trump's tweets from 2013 yelling at Obama, saying that you can't go attack Assad and you need congressional approval to do it. And saying, that would be a bad move for the United States and create a disaster in Syria to go after Assad. And so now suddenly he's going against that, what he believed in 2013, and saying that Obama should have went out and taken out Assad in 2013. What really happened in 2013 is Obama drew the red line, and then there was a false flag sarin attack by the Syrian rebels, Al-Qaeda al-Nusra groups. And it's likely that sarin came through Turkey, and I'm not quite sure exactly where it came from, but it was a false flag attack carried out by the rebels to try to draw Obama and the Americans into the Syrian civil war. If there's been one thing learned in the Middle East, is that if you could get the Americans involved, you could do an awful lot of damage. Look what Saudi Arabia is able to do to the Houthis by the American involvement. While they're not necessarily winning the war, they're able to wage an absolutely brutal campaign against their enemies and have pretty much all the weapons and support they need to do so. In Israel, you have the backing of the Americans that allows Israel, or helps Israel at the very least, to suppress the Palestinians. Of course, in Iraq, we had the United States fight a civil war for the Shias and kick most of the Sunnis out of Baghdad, really turning the Iraqi state into a Shia state. The best example of this, of course, may be Libya, where propaganda was created to say that Gaddafi was going to go into Benghazi and kill every man, woman, and child, and that he was giving his soldiers Viagra so they could rape women more. And while those claims are completely untrue, the United States started bombing Gaddafi and supported Al-Qaeda-backed rebels going in and taking over and then killing Gaddafi and really fracturing that country into a bunch of pieces. And so while the American people may not notice these things going on, the people of the Middle East certainly do, and the jihadists do, and they learn different tactics. And so, the Al-Qaeda guys learned that if you could bait the Americans in on your side, then it's going to be a lot easier war to win. rather than Barack Obama getting dragged into the war, and for a couple of reasons was unable to do this. One is because the American people were flat out against it, and the resolution may not have passed Congress had it actually gone to the floor. And also Vladimir Putin helped Obama out by saying that he will take and destroy all of Assad's chemical weapons. That way we could guarantee that an attack isn't going to occur. And this was confirmed by the International Watchdog Group on Chemical Weapons. And so it wasn't that Obama failed. Obama didn't get permission from the American people. And also it's a great thing that Obama didn't do this. Brad Hoff has talked about a document that was created by American intelligence in the 1980s that said that the United States went in and overthrew then Bashar al-Assad's father. It would create a situation where the best case scenario would be that the Muslim Brotherhood takes over Syria. I think what we saw in the Syrian civil war is that best hope was just a hope, in that what would have happened is if Assad lost Syria is that ISIS or Al-Qaeda, or a combination of the two, would have ruled most of the lands of Syria. And so Obama made the right move by not going to war in Syria, and this was aided by the American people and Putin, who really forced him into making this decision. Had it been left to Obama and the war makers, they probably would have just gone ahead and bombed Assad. And also in Trump's tweet, he calls on Russia, Syria, and Iran to allow a corridor in to Dorma for inspectors to come in and I guess look for evidence that Assad carried out a chemical weapons attack. I'm guessing that they're not going to let people in because what they're trying to do there is starve the rebels out. And so this would go against that policy. And of course, it seems like a lot of times when you let people into these areas, it ends up being somehow weapons end up going to the rebels en masse. Trump's tweet here was, I think, pretty scary to me. If you remember back to last year when this did cause Donald Trump to launch those 59 Tomahawk missiles at an Assad air base, this could lead to violence between the Americans and the Assad government. I mean, hopefully that Trump wouldn't be stupid enough to actually go try to kill Assad. Whether or not he was able to do that would be one thing, and what the Russian response would be another. But having the country fall to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, just as the Americans are saying that everything we have to do in Syria is about defeating ISIS, would be really the only way American and foreign policy in Syria could be even more of a failure than it already is. And then the other issue would just be butting up against Russia here. The United States doesn't need to pick a fight with Russia over Syria. Let's be honest, what does it matter to Americans who controls what land in Syria? For the most part, it really doesn't matter. If we leave Syria to Assad, he's not going to allow the Sunni rebellion, the people Americans are most afraid of, the actual stated enemies of the American people, ISIS and al-Nusra. That's who he's going to go after. And so I think it's, more clear than ever that Trump's instincts were right, that the United States needs to leave Syria. However, you have another chemical weapons attack and suddenly Trump is looking like he might be baited into attacking Assad. The last thing I want to talk about on Syria is that Trump apparently had a call with Bibi Netanyahu about a week or so ago, and this was after Trump made the statements that he wanted to leave Syria, but before he announced that the United States was going to stay. And apparently this conversation was very tense, as Bibi Netanyahu who's of course the Israeli prime minister, wanted the United States to remain in Syria, and Trump did not. Now I find it really funny that the mainstream media freaked out and said that Donald Trump was a puppet of Russia when he talked about leaving Syria, but then it turns out they called a different head of state, and that head of state disagreed with that policy, and then Trump went along with him, and yet nobody saying that America is a puppet of the Israeli government, or Donald Trump is a puppet of the Israeli government. And I also want to mention there's a really great interview with Joanne Leone, Around the Empire podcast, and Elijah Magnier on this situation in Syria. I mean, there's just a ton of good information in that podcast that you really won't get anywhere else. Now, again, link to that in the show notes page. On Friday, you had another round of protests in Gaza. I think these were called the tire protests, as the Palestinians lit a bunch of tires on fire and pushed them up against the fence. I saw a commentator on Twitter saying what I suspected on last week's show about the Palestinian protests. And I suggest you all go back and check out that episode because I do a pretty good dive into what's going on and why the Palestinians are protesting, the brutality of the Israelis against them. But those burning tires were meant to obscure the sniper fire by the Israeli government. Now, unfortunately, even if they're able to obscure the line of sight of the Israeli snipers, the Israeli army has drones, and on the protest on Friday, one of the protesters was actually killed by an armed Israeli drone. Over 100 people were injured in Friday's protest. Another 10 were killed. This is in addition to, I believe, around 19 that were killed in last week's protest. 2 of the dead were teenagers. One was a journalist in a blue vest that read press. So there was absolutely no excuse for them to mistake this man at all for somebody who was going to be violent. He was well over 100 meters away from the fence. That is the wall of the prison that the Gazans live in. And 100 meters has been more or less the zone that the Israelis claim that the Gazans have to stay away from the border fence there, or they will start to shoot them. I don't have much else to add that I didn't put in last week's episode, other than I did find out that between 2/3 and 80% of the people that live in Gaza are refugees. And so, as I was saying before, this is a giant refugee camp turned into a prison. The people living there want to return to their homes. Gaza is not necessarily their home. Areas of Israel are, and they were forced from that land and they want to return from it, which is the international right given to refugees. Now, that's going to be very complicated of a situation in Israel. However, it's pretty clear that what's going on by the Israeli Defense Forces here, killing protesters, shooting some in the ankles, a lot of times, crippling them, especially since there's not great medical care in Gaza. As I was talking about on the last show, at times they only have power for about 4 hours a day. And so the people there really don't live great lives. While Israel's a first world country with free education and free healthcare to citizens, the people of Gaza live in a refugee camp. Some say that it may be uninhabitable by 2020, as a lot of the buildings were destroyed and they're not able to import concrete to rebuild them. And there's 2 million people living there. The numbers are just staggering. The Gazans originally planned 6 weeks of protests to occur here. We're already through 2 of those, so it looks like 4 more to come. It seems the death of the journalist is a little bit of a rallying cry for the people of Gaza. He was a pretty popular journalist, in no way allied with Hamas, and had captured some footage of Israel carrying out some pretty brutal crimes in Gaza in the past. And so this was taken very seriously by the people of Gaza. I want to mention that the State Department approved U.S. companies to sell technology to build submarines to Taiwan. I'm sure this move will upset China, as China believes in a one China policy, meaning that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States states that they are a part of a one China policy, just like they say they are in favor of a 2-state solution in Israel, although their actions in both cases don't reflect the rhetoric as we continue to sell the Taiwanese a bunch of weapons. I think some of the problems with this move aren't necessarily related to giving Taiwan the submarine technology, because I'm not sure how or if that would really shift any balance of power between Taiwan and China, but that Trump is somewhat picking a trade war right now with China. And then we had the North Korean talks coming up, and China is a key ally to North Korea. So it seems silly to be picking all these fights with the North Koreans right now, or with the Chinese right now, when they could be such a strategic and important power in working out a deal with the North Koreans. Last thing I wanted to talk about before I wrap up the show. I read that the United States spent $60 million on a power station in Afghanistan that doesn't work, and if it did work, would probably be a danger to the civilians living around it. And so it just shows that the United States can't nation build in Afghanistan. We can't nation build everywhere. We should just come home. This is, absolutely ridiculous. And one of the reasons that it's so important that we come home is that blowback is real and that blowback happens. Mance Raider, who does the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast, which is a great show. It's usually on the blog at libertarianinstitute.org, and I'll link to this episode in the show notes page, but covers how the Pulse nightclub shooting wasn't actually an attack that targeted the LGBTQ community. It was blowback. Omar Mateen was not a man who hated gay people. There was a lot of speculation and reporting that Omar Mateen carried out the attack because he was a closet gay person, and because he was a Muslim, he wouldn't be accepted by his community if he came out. And so this created a whole bunch of built up anger, and eventually he just went, I guess, and shot all the people that he was jealous of who were able to live, out and free lives. But it's worth noting, and Mans points out how the Pulse nightclub wasn't actually his first target. It was a Disney target that he wanted to go to first, and went to several other places before getting to the Pulse nightclub. It seemed that Omar Mateen was interested in carrying out a terrorist attack in America because he had been watching a whole bunch of videos online of U.S. attacks killing Afghani civilians. The United States has killed thousands of civilians in Afghanistan with our bombs. Many of these are recorded on camera now, or at least there's photos of the aftermath. And so if somebody identifies and who sympathizes with the people of Iraq, of Afghanistan, this is going to be very, very upsetting to them. And in some cases, those people are, maybe people that are predisposed to, being likely to carry out violence or have some mental instability, whatever. But this upset Omar Mateen so much that he picked up a rifle, went out and killed a bunch of people. And this was blowback. And that's very important, because if this is blowback, then the problem isn't too many guns in America. The problem isn't that we're not accepting enough of gay culture. The problem is that we're killing hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people overseas with our foreign aggressive wars. And guess what? The people over there care about the relatives that die. They care about their children that are killed. And so we need to pay attention to that to understand why attacks are happening in America. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I don't know, felt a little off today. I hope it was good. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. I now have a Minds profile, and I'm posting there a lot. I really like this new social networking site, minds.com. I'm Immersion News. And like I said, I usually don't post a whole lot on social media, but I'm really taking my time to post a lot of stuff with some analysis on this new site. So if you guys have a profile, subscribe to me, like and bump up my content. I really appreciate it if you could do that. For those of you who don't have a profile, check it out. See if it's for you. I got a pretty discouraging message from Facebook about how they're now going to have, supposed non-biased moderators go through and either bump up or bump down content on Facebook. And so, what I say here isn't in the mainstream. And if they're just looking for what you're saying to match the mainstream, then I might not do so well in those ratings. Immersion News on Twitter, not on Twitter, Immersion News on YouTube and on BitChute at KYAAALE on Twitter. I'm on MeWe now, Facebook, Libertarian Union. Oh, and if you want to donate to the show and help it to grow, Foreign Policy Focus or patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Thanks everybody for tuning in.